and sort of go back to the basics and revisit some of Lisa's original folders, the ones that we had before the revelation of Lisa with all the embossing folders. We have a stencil to go alongside, but there are a good few original folders that don't have the stencils. So I wanted to just revisit, because we have so many new members joining all the time, and it's possible that they haven't yet discovered the back catalogue. So I just wanted to revisit them, and also just revisit the techniques on how to colour them. So if you remember last week, didn't I, on Thursday, and showed you about 3 techniques then on how to colour them. So there's a couple of different mediums. So all the techniques that I'm using today, and also that I used on Thursday, can be applied to the embossing folders. And I've actually used alcohol pens on this. I use Copics, but depending on what you have in your own stash, it really doesn't matter. But I'll show you how I achieved this look. And then this one here, I've used Lisa. Going from the Slimline collection, so it's a DL embossing folder, and all of my cardstock again, the super smooth cardstock. It's fabulous cardstock to both blend your colours onto, to use your alcohol pens onto, because there's no bleeding, and also it takes the emboss really well, and the card doesn't distort, so you get a really nice clean. Also on this one in particular, the other Slimline or DL folder, it's the natural wood grain, and this is a really lovely one through the die cutting machine. The emboss and the deboss, they're both different, but they are equally as usable, I would say. So because I'm going to colour tint this, I'm actually going to use the emboss, so there's going to be less raised details, as you can see here. But if you wanted to emboss this onto a different coloured cardstock and just highlight it gently, then I would say those folders where the emboss and deboss, because of the intricacy of the design, it really can be used both ways. So it really is just personal choice, actually. But I'm going to use it this way, where the larger veins that you can see here are actually embossed. And all I've done is to take one of Lisa's inks. This is the painted Eggshell, which is a matte blending ink. And initially I'm just going to very gently just run the ink down the details of blending brush. And we can just start blending that ink as it settles more into the cardstock and doesn't look as bold and as scary. So once we've blended out what we can from the initial ink, now you can carry on with this and make a far bolder statement with the ink if you want to keep going with the direct to paper technique. But because I'm setting this against really nice pale flowers, I want to keep this quite subtle. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more ink with my blending brush and just start to the, as you can see, I'm only really using the top part of this embossing folder. So what you could do if you wanted, you could just take the bottom off. I'm going to leave it all as it is because it keeps the stability of the whole card. I think what I might do, you've seen sort of the detail of that wood grain coming out there, but if I show you the difference, if I put this onto the back, it's not going to affect the rest of the card. You can see how much more detailed the emboss or the deboss, it depends how you look at it, to be honest, but you can, that hopefully will show you the difference between the two sides. Now for me, this would actually be too much for this particular card, but if you were creating a different card where you want that wood grain to really come to the fore, then this is a really good side for that. So I turn that back round, and that for me is colouring our coneflowers. I had to Google actually what a coneflower was, and it's one of those flowers. It came back, it's part of the Echinacea flower group, and it can come in all sorts of different colours. Now I like the look of it being a daisy like this. I think that suits it really well, but the coneflowers can come in really vibrant pink colours and also orange colours, where the middle part of the flower is almost sort of real dark burnt orange going into a browny colour. So for us as crafters, it's perfect. We can pretty much throw any colour at this and it will be right. So what I'm going to do to start with is I'm just going to take off this top layer. Now this area which isn't embossed is perfect for you to be putting your centimetre of the embossed image that we have, but in this particular case I want the wood grain to shine through. So all I'm going to do is use my scissors, and you don't have to use large scissors. I just find these really quite easy to use. I've got used to using them now. And I'm just going to just cut around the detail. It doesn't have to be precise, and you can do this either as close to the design as you want to, or you can take yourself a straight line from one side to the other. Shaped piece of cardstock. There's Hazel in the background. Because what we can then do, we can layer that onto our wood grain, and that shines through at the back, and I think that's a really nice backdrop, particularly as you've noticed here on this card. You can actually 3D that, so you get a little bit of dimension, so you get a little bit of shadow. Alcohol markers to colour this. I use Copics, that's what I have at the moment, but obviously you may also have your own particular way of colouring with any of your sort of colouring mediums, particularly your alcohol markers. I like to go from light to dark and build up the colour that way. So I'm going with a real pale yellow, and initially I'm just going to colour through the central part of the flower and just cover half of that like so. And I'll go for almost a blender colour and just blend that in, so we have the top part of the flower left whiter. Before I come in with the darker yellow, and this can start actually making those colours pop. The darker yellow I'm just doing as a blend just around the outside. And I just keep working back through the different shades. So I'm going back to my mid shade again and just blending out that line so it doesn't look so harsh. And I'll perhaps just take that up a little bit higher. And this really is a case of, you can do this quite quick actually. You don't really need to think too much about it. But if you want to spend the time really getting those details and those really lovely blends, and you're familiar with alcohol markers, then obviously you've got a really lovely afternoon's project in this colour in here. So just make sure I get those petals. So that makes that blending really quite quick. And if I just leave that one here, this is the mid colour again. You can see the difference in the two blends. I won't do all of the flowers because I'll be here all afternoon doing that. So perhaps if I do this one in the mid colour and go all the way up, and you can see that even if you didn't want to do that blend, just that colour in itself works really well. And I could perhaps put a tiny little bit of the darker colour just along the base. And just blend out that line really slowly. Right, because I want these to look like daisies, we've obviously want to have white petals. Now the way to do that and make the white petals pop is to use a grey. Now if you go with a real palest of greys, and really again this is where working from the pale colour up to the darker colour really, to me, makes this a lot easier. You can start at the top of the petal, which is up near the coloured part of the flower, and just flick the colour down into the petals. So basically the ends of the petals are left white, and just by flicking and just removing that pressure, it gives you a really nice blend. Now you can see what I've done here. I've actually built up those colours. If you wanted to leave that like that, then you can do, and perhaps even just going over with the same colour again, doing the same flick but not as far down into the petals. That just gives you that little bit of shading, and when that dries, you've got that element of shading from the top of the petals down, and that just gives you the illusion of a white petal, especially when you come down into the flower below. The contrast between the middle of the flower here and the ends of those white petals just gives that illusion of a really nice white petal. Now Lisa has put the shading in there for us, so that does allow us to have that bit more confidence in adding that little extra bit of shading. So I'm going in with the next shade up of the grey that I'm using, and just very gently, just one stroke initially, along the same place on each of the petals. I'm using the left hand part of the petal, and that's just working all the way around, and it's just one stroke down, and you can see again that just adds that tiny bit more detail, but I'm not doing a huge amount of blending. So to me that is a real easy way to add shading. So Lisa's given us the detail there, all we need to do is follow. So again, if we do this on, and you can see the difference between this flower and that flower, although we've got the white petals and we want to, that's what we want to achieve, this actually brings it to life a little bit more. And I think I've also done another video in the past actually on how to shade a white flower. I might actually link that one when I put this onto YouTube a little bit later on, because it sort of goes against the grain, doesn't it? If you want a white flower on white cardstock, obviously you need to make it pop from the paper a little bit. So just using that grey, even a pale blue works really well, to be honest, or any pale colour, which if you're using alcohol markers, you will have the gradients of those colours, so go for the palest of colours. Okay, so that's with the flowers. Obviously we got some stems in here which we want to highlight. Again, I'm going with the palest of greens really, because I don't want anything to sort of really jar, and I want all the shading to work really well. So we just highlight those stems. Again, I'm not coming all the way down to the base of the stem, because I like that sort of graduated colour. So we can just highlight those. It really doesn't take much at all. Now another thing, just to distinguish each of the flowers, I've used again the palest of greens, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to colour all that negative space between the petals and each of the flowers. Now this is the palest of greens, which when it dries is barely there, so you're not adding it really as a specific colour, but what it does do, it just breaks up the whiteness between each of the flowers and just adds that tiny little, that really subtle background. So but just by using this ever so subtle green, and you can use a grey or even a blue, that makes the white of those that you've left of the petals just pop even more. And again, because I'm using Lisa's super smooth cardstock, it's brilliant for alcohol markers. There's no bleeding, so where you actually lay the ink down is where it stays. You know, there's nothing worse than using a cardstock, especially when you're blending and the ink migrates to somewhere where you don't want it to do. So you can actually see how that's coming together, and if I start colouring all this negative space around the flowers, it really makes those flowers pop. Now what you could do, it might be quite nice just to do one statement flower and leave the rest white, or you can go on and colour all the flowers like this. But I think that just really suits those flowers. And again, when we actually layer that against the wood grain at the back, the grey of the wood grain at the back really makes the grey of the petals stand out. So I think that really ties in the whole project. And then you can add your sentiment at the top, and you can go as fancy or as simple as you like with that. So just a simple black and white one there, and I've used Lisa's stickers, simple happy birthday on it. I think that looks really smart. You can put this down here also. Again, if I put this on here, it would be such a shame to cover over a lot of the blending of the flowers that you've done, which is why I thought it'd be really nice for that to sit up there. Yes, complete contrast. We're coming onto a black cardstock. And for this, we're using a completely different medium. We're using Lisa's artist waxes, which are on the website. I have the 4. There is a 5th one, I believe, which is a ruby goldy colour. Yeah, a ruby colour. I'm not sure if that's in stock at the moment, but many of you will have it, and that would actually look perfect with these flowers too. Now, if you've never used these, or you're not as confident using these, what you can do is just have a plain piece of embossing on whatever colour you choose. I mean, the waxes do actually work on the lighter cardstocks too. And then you can just highlight part of that design by just die cutting yourself a shape. I've chosen a circle, but you can use any of the nested shapes that you have. So you die cut yourself your shape first, and then you decide where you might want that to highlight anywhere on your design. I've chosen this flower here, and then you can just emboss this die cut itself in the embossing folder in the area that you want to highlight. Okay, so you just emboss that, which is what I've done there, and that would sit just like that. And if you're not familiar with using the artist wax, or you're not particularly confident in the blending of them, you can just use this spot highlight. So you're not having to emboss, you're not having to colour tint the whole of your embossing folder. You can just do the smaller area. So if I go with the, what shall I use? I'll go with the gold. Now, I've had these for ages and they've been sitting there for a long time. And the beauty of these over other gilding waxes that I've used is that these still stay fresh enough to use. I haven't used these for probably a good long time, because I say I'm not particularly confident using these myself. I know that there are other people in the design team that have got fabulous blends onto darker cardstocks. I think Dawn's done it on a couple of lives, and a couple of people using them on other embossing folders. Doesn't quite work that way for me, but then we all have to learn, don't we? We all have our strengths. But using it on a smaller area like this is far less daunting. So I can actually take that's still moist enough, and that sits on my finger really nicely. And you can, if you take too much, you can dab it off on into the lid there, but just really gently, just start blending that over the top. I found in small circles, as we would do with our blending tools, just over the top of the embossing there. And you don't need to press too hard, because I think then you would lose too much detail into or in between the embossed images. So you can create a level of shading with this, because obviously as the wax works itself off of your finger onto the cardstock, then it goes on with less intensity. So you do get a slight amount of shade going on there, which is nice. But again, I think this is far less daunting doing it on the smaller area, and it gives you a good way to practice before actually tackling the whole of the image. You can blend colours together, so I'll perhaps come in with the Copper Pot, which is a gorgeous colour again. I still use the same finger, and we can just start blending that into different areas. And that gives us a two-tone on the flower there. Hopefully the camera's picking that up for you. And now we have the petals around the outside. So I think what I might do, I might come in with the Golden Chameleon, which I think is my ultimate favourite out of all of them. And this looks lovely. If you use this on a white cardstock, if you actually do your ink blending onto white cardstock with all your brushes and your inks as normal, and then go over just some of the details with this chameleon, it just adds a luster to the areas that you've blended, and really works with each of the colours that you've added onto the ink, onto the paper. I think that's so pretty, so that might be worth doing as well. But you can see as I'm adding it on here, some of the colour that I had on, that I've picked up previously on my finger, is also coming through, so that gives us that lovely slight blend there. And because Lisa's embossing folders, they're the best in the business, they really are, the 3D nature of them, it means that the wax really only does hit the embossed areas. Let me see if I can just raise that up a little bit, so you can see that detail just coming out there. And that would add a real classy look actually to your card, just by using that one highlighted area. Obviously, if you're familiar with using waxes, and you can go to town and do the whole folder, of course. But I think if you just perhaps wanted to just get used to this, or what you could do, actually thinking about it, you could cut yourself perhaps 4 of these smaller die cut pieces on a square, and just mount them separately on a square card. So you're using just a very small amount, a small area from the embossing folder. That can be a standalone piece in itself. You've got the beauty of the detail. So that would actually work as well. Or we can add that onto our cardstock. Now you see this one here, I've just framed that simply with one of the Slimline dies in a gold frame, just to highlight the colour that we have. I've added my spotlight of colour, and again this top area is just perfect to add a sentiment. Again, I'll just take the one that I used earlier on, and this time I've put this on a gold layer, so we can set that either there against the highlight, or we can use that up the top, or if you could using one of Lisa's larger die cut sentiments, then obviously that has got space to go up the top as well. But it's just a really nice simple card. So that's, if I'm thinking back to the last live that I've done, that's probably 5 techniques that you've got to actually colour an embossing folder without using the stencils. Now, something that we do have at our disposal now to use are Lisa's interference inks, which we've all seen how magic they are, going from a white cardstock to a darker cardstock. So why not colour tin our dark embossing with some interference inks? I didn't prep this one, but let's give it a go. I've got 2 colours here. I've got the Cherry Bomb and the Galaxy Dream. Now, I've used Cherry Bomb last week, so let's use a different colour just to make sure that they all get a good use. Okay, I'm just finding the right sponge. Now you can see here that the ink comes out brown, or sort of purpley colour if you were using this onto a white cardstock. So let's see how this appears onto a black cardstock. So we pick up our ink and just gently over the top. It gives us a very different look to the gilding wax, but I think still just as stunning. Now I can see the pink hues on this already. So let me just add a little bit more. I find that you can, with these inks, you can actually be quite generous, and the best way to pick them up onto the sponge I found is to actually stroke them against the top of the sponge as opposed to dabbing. And that gives you a really good amount of ink to put onto the cardstock there. And of course with these inks they've got the mica in them, so these will sort of develop as the ink dries. So you can almost go away, leave these to dry, and they come back looking better. So if I can just tilt that to the camera, you put that, yeah, there you go, there's that detail there. This is one to actually play with and find the colour that you like, and be a lot easier for you to see at home. Our cherry bomb, I will use the cherry bomb, and let's see if that comes. Oh, this looks really like raspberry coloured on the black here, so maybe you can see this one a little bit more. Remember, these inks blend just as well as your matte blending inks, so you can use two colours. So let's just show you there. That's a real raspberry colour coming through. So that gives you another option, just another way to blend on top of onto a darker cardstock. Last technique is the watercolouring technique, but I find when I watercolour, I like to use the ink pads. I get on really well with a blending mat underneath and one of Lisa's water brushes. I don't always use the water reservoir, I must admit. I do use a spray bottle and add just a little bit of water onto my blending mat. So all I do, I just take a little bit of ink and sort of smush it onto my blending mat there, just as a palette. Now all I've done here initially, I've embossed onto a watercolour cardstock, and I've just put a light colour over initially. I'm just going to add some water onto my blending mat away from the colour. So I just pick up some colour, pick up some ink, and I can just start colouring directly onto the watercolour cardstock there. Now this is more of a project because I've found that to add depth and colour into this, you do need to allow the layers to dry. I find by using my ink pads and picking up the ink and the colour this way, I find it a lot easier to control the amount of water that I'm using for each of the layers, so therefore I don't need to wait for too long. You do need to be a little bit more patient with these watercolour techniques. Now you can see some of these darker marks that I've got here. What you can also do is drag your ink pad over the embossing and then just use your water brush to drag out that colour. That works also. So these areas here that you can see are speckled, this is purely where I've taken my ink pad and just drag that over the top. Okay, I won't do that now because I've got areas that are wet here, and my brush is now clean. You see, it's just wet, and that means that I can just, with a little bit of patience, I can just use that wet brush over those inked areas, and that ink will bleed out and give you enough colour to cover that area. So I find that is a really nice way also to watercolour. Now we've got somebody on the design team, Leanne, who is amazing at watercolouring, and I would love to have some lessons from her one of these days. Well, it might be a little while in the future actually, when I actually have some time to myself. I would love to learn to watercolour like that, but I think you need time, and I think you need a bit of patience, neither of which I have at the moment. But it's something on my bucket list and something that I can aim for. But you can see though, just by using this technique, it really does give you a different look to everything else that we've done so far. So I think this is, for me, with what I can achieve at the moment, you know, a realistic way of watercolouring. Now, once you reach an area that is dry, you can go back, pick up a little bit more ink with less water and start adding the shading that way. And you can see there that I've actually added a darker layer. And again, like I said before, when I was using the alcohol markers, you follow Lisa's lead with the shading that she's put on. So that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, and you can add those darker areas. And I think, so with a bit of patience and just allowing yourself a cup of tea, or go and have a little wander, or check on the kids, or take the dog out for a walk, let your layers dry and come back and just do the next layer and just add that little bit. Just layer it up little by little. So it's more of a project, but it's actually really quite satisfying once you've got it right. It is actually, as you can see, I'm actually getting quite into this again now. But take your time with that, and that can really give you a really nice special effect. So that's 3 more techniques on how to use your embossing folders without the stencils that we sort of know and love with all of Lisa's current designs. But say there definitely is a place for the original embossing folders, and they are so pretty. So it would be such a shame to forget them and not use them. And it really does just give us completely different looks as well. So there is a place for everything in the stash, and hopefully that's, between this live and the one that I done before, that's given you a good library of techniques to use, something just to refer back to, and just something nice to remember, isn't it? So hopefully you've all stayed with me this afternoon. The yellow really does pop on these ones, doesn't it? I really like them as daisies. I think daisies are such a pretty flower, sort of en masse. And I know we have daisies in the collection. Lisa has done a daisy specifically, but with a little bit of artistic license, I think we're allowed to add whatever colours we like to the embossing folders, aren't we? And I think actually, when I first started this, it might have been the first time I've used this, I'm ashamed to say. So it's a really nice excuse actually for me to go through my stash and make sure that I've used everything and sort of go back to basics with it all. So thanks for joining me this afternoon. Enjoy your week, everybody, and I shall look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everyone.